Your background, it's pretty earthy, but how did you connect that with your current political perspective? You said that you became disillusioned with socialism.
I became disillusioned with ideology, I would say.
With ideology in general.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's certainly not something that's changed. I mean, I don't like ideologues. Mm-hmm. I think that it's ignorant to begin with, in the technical sense, is that you apply an ideological solution to a problem when you actually don't understand the problem and you don't have a solution, because most problems have to be dealt with at the level of detail. The left is degenerated into identity politics, obviously, and that's no secret. And then the right-winger types, well, they're playing the same game, and they increasingly say that. They say, well, look, the game is identity politics. Okay, fine.
So there is no way to get rid of inequality?
Well, there's no reliable way that we know of to get rid of inequality. Well, there's no way of getting rid of inequality per se, because, and it's not even clear that you want to, because I don't think you want everyone to be exactly the same across all dimensions. I mean, that's another problem with the whole equity idea, as far as I'm concerned, is like, yeah, really? You want equality of outcome? Okay. Across what parameters? All of them? You don't want people to differ in any way? Oh no, well, we'll just limit it to the economic. Okay, well, good luck with that limiting. The borders around what constitutes economics aren't obvious. So the equity doctrines are absolutely deadly. I think that, you know, we've figured out fundamentally that the way you cordon off the intolerable right is by noting who makes claims of racial superiority and saying that's a no-go zone. That's where reasonable conservatives draw the line. On the left, I think what we need to do is the same thing with equity. As soon as someone talks about equity, it's like, no, they've wandered off the cliff, and there's no excuse for it whatsoever. We know what happens when right-wing governments adopt racial superiority doctrines, right? We know what happens. We get an extraordinarily toxic form of tribalism and blood. So that seems like a very bad idea. Well, when does that happen on the left? Well, it's not so obvious, because the ideas on the left have this appeal to universalism that makes them credible and attractive, especially to people who are compassionate. But there is a line. Well, I'm suggesting that the line is crossed when we start talking about equality of outcome, because it's technically not tenable, but it's also, there's also this terrible resentment that's driving it, and that resentment tends to manifest itself in very negative political outcomes. One of the lines in the New Testament that I've tripped over many times is Christ is being anointed with a very costly vial of perfume, and his disciples are taking the woman who does that to task for wasting money that could have been spent on the poor. It's a very complicated story, but Christ tells his disciples that the poor will be with us always, and that's something that I've spent a lot of time trying to understand why that statement would be made. That, and to those who have everything, more will be given, and from those who have nothing, everything will be taken, which is a discussion, which is a very, very succinct observation about the continuing existence of inequality. So there's evidence throughout the New Testament of observation of the inevitability of inequality. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's a moral good.
In a way, you're appealing to a certain political viewpoint.
Well, that's what people claim.
That's your fans. Your fan base seems to come from that side.
No, I don't agree with that at all. I think that, first of all, you know, whether or not what I have are fans is debatable. Rock stars have fans. I'm not a performance artist. I don't have fans. I have people who are listening carefully to what I'm saying. And it's very complicated what I'm saying. So they're not just fans. Second, there's a very large number of them. Third, they stack up everywhere from the radical leftists don't like me, to the right. And there are people all along that spectrum, and there's no way of identifying, because they fall along that entire spectrum, there's no real reason to pull out a particular subset of them and say, well, they're indicative of the lot. Now, the radical leftists like to do that, and they say, well, you're probably a right-winger, because a radical right-winger, let's say, because radical right-wingers also oppose us. It's like, well, yeah, everyone to the left of everyone to the right of the radical left is not a radical right-winger. It encompasses the entire spectrum.
Are you a radical right-winger?
It's a silly question. What's the evidence for that?
I'm not asking for. I'm asking you.
it's ridiculous to defend yourself against an accusation that has no grounds.
So what is your political perspective?
I don't really have a political perspective. I'm not trying to play a political game. And I don't think that the problem that we're having right now is a political problem. I think it's deeper than that, which is what I said right from the beginning, which is why I think that what I'm doing is resonating. So let's consider me a psychological diagnostician.
So to the extent that your fan base does come from what we would call the alt-right, what do you think of them? What do you think of them as, obviously their ideology is very amorphous.
Oh, I think that anybody who plays identity politics is playing a bad game. I don't care whether they're playing it on the left or the right, and I've made that perfectly clear, although perhaps I haven't concentrated on it as much as I might, but like I said, I don't see the right as a threat in the university campuses, for example, and that's a large part of the place that I've been fighting this battle. So, but I don't like identity politics. I don't care who's playing it. And so the alt-right tends towards identity politics, and you know, maybe they thought, maybe there was a proportion of them who were hoping I was their boy when I came out against the radical left, because if you come out against the radical left, it's not obvious where you sit on the political spectrum, right? You could sit anywhere on the political spectrum. But I'm for the sovereignty of the individual, and that isn't what you're for if you're an identitarian. You're for the sovereignty of the group.
So what do you say to those who say that you are an alt-right thinker?
I don't generally say a lot. It's like that's an easy excuse if you happen to be a supporter of the radical left, and that's where most of that's coming from. Well, here's what it is. The radical left thinks their policies are reasonable. So then someone like me comes up and says, hey, you're not reasonable at all. Well, then they have two choices. Either I'm reasonable and there's something wrong with their policies, or I must be part of the reprehensible radical right. It's like, well, that's an easy choice. It's like, well, you're a fascist, or you're a Nazi, or you're a transphobe, or you're a bigot, or you're anti-Semitic, or you're an Islamophobe, or, you know, there's a whole panoply of terms that can be used to deny the validity of your opponent's viewpoint. Well, I'm no fan of the radical left, but that doesn't make me a member of the radical right. It's wishful thinking on the part of the radical left. There's no evidence for it whatsoever.
Stand up with your back straight, put your shoulders back, don't tell lies. This is a father talking to his son. This is
right,
what we heard in the Boy Scouts.
It's exactly that, which is also why so many people who don't have fathers are reacting positively to me. It's like in times of radical uncertainty, what was once common becomes profound. And partly what I'm doing in that book and with the lectures that I'm doing is to look at those things that we all took for granted at one point and to say, look, despite their commonplace nature, there are profound reasons why these norms exist, why these norms and traditions exist, and we dispense with them at our peril.
In the book, you're clearly you're clearly speaking, it seems to me, to young men. That seems to be the primary audience. Is that fair?
I wouldn't say so. I mean, one of the things that's happened because I've become very popular on YouTube is that a large number of my listeners, let's say, have been young men, but it's hard to distinguish that from the baseline fact that about 75% of YouTube watchers are men.
Chaos is something that you say is distinctly feminine, whereas order is something
it's symbolized by the feminine, yeah.
Okay, so you posit that. So this almost seems like, in certain ways, an antidote to femininity. Is that not the case?
It's an attempt. I think that. Let me think here for a minute how to put that properly. Under other political conditions, it could have been an antidote to order. But I think that the fundamental threats that our society faces now are threats from the side of chaos, from the side of destabilization, rather than, in our culture at least, rather than from the side of tyranny. You do mention, though, in the book, you say partly what this means for the future is that if men are pushed too hard to feminize, they will become more and more interested in harsh fascist political ideology. Yeah, definitely. That will definitely happen. That's already happening.
And you're seeing that. Tell me about Donald Trump. Do you see that as part of this? Do you see that move to the right?
No, only peripherally. Well, no, I don't even see that there has been a move to the right, particularly in the U.S. It's been 50-50 Democrats and Republicans for like the last 20 years.
You mentioned something about Islam on Twitter. You said that do feminists not attack Islam because they're secretly desiring of,
well, there's a real question there. It's like, Do you see the feminists criticizing Saudi Arabia?
Yes.
Well, not very much.
Yeah.
That's for sure. So, like, what's going on there?
I feel like as though they do. I don't know.
Well, I don't feel, okay, well, some of them do some of the time, but they seem to, what would you say, reserve most of their vitriol for the oppressive patriarchal structures of the West. There aren't societies in the world where women have more status than the West.
Should they be happy with what they have?
I don't know if people should or could ever be happy with what they have, but a little bit of gratitude might be in order. A little bit of understanding of the situation in a historical context might be in order.